Hey, what's up everyone? Mendel here. Hope you're all doing awesome and wonderful. And in this video, we're going to mix some rock drums. So let's get right to it. Here we go. Alright, so here we have a Cubase session of a rock track I'm working on. This is like stadium American rock, what I'm going for. So let's first listen to the chorus, followed by the main riff, and then we'll dive more into the rock drums mixing. Alright, so you get the point, like heavy stadium rock. The drums are a bit lacking, they need some compression, I think some brighten up. The rooms are kind of a bit honky, and overall they lack a tiny bit of energy, like really powerful drums. Let's first start with the rooms, to be honest. So what I like to do when mixing rock drums, just cut a tiny bit of mids on the rooms. So there's also more room in the mix for other stuff. And there are some nasty high frequencies. Now, one thing I like to do when mixing rock drums versus metal drums is actually emphasize the rooms a bit more, but also use the low end that the room mics capture to emphasize the kick drum. So almost like a big smiley curve, like scoop out some mids, I remove some nasty frequencies on the high end, and adding a ton of low end for the kick drum. And then add some compression to make the rooms even sound more bigger. So early attack, early release. So let's just see how it sits in the mix. So that's good. Then the overheads, almost the same thing. Sometimes I even copy paste the same settings from my rooms to the overheads or vice versa. But same thing, cut out a tiny bit of mids. Like remove some nasty frequencies. Perhaps add a tiny bit of sizzle on the top end. Like that kind of shiny thing. And over here I like to do a tiny bit of compression, just so that the attack of the cymbals are kind of smoothened out. So that like the wash of the cymbals becomes a bit more even. So far we have this. And now one of the most important things, energy-wise, is the kick drum, of course. So let's just try out this new compressor here, which is based on this famous compressor, which is, if you can find an original one, is, I don't know, maybe over 10,000 or perhaps 20,000 euros. And then we have it here in plugin format. So what I like to do is put the bandwidth on 10 and then boost the kick drum around 50 hertz. Because in my mixes, I like to have the kick drum like below the bass. So it depends on your mix. Sometimes you can have the bass guitar do all the low end stuff and then the kick drum around 100 hertz or 90 hertz. But I really like that modern, thick, let's say like pounding, like 50 hertz, that subby kick, so I can really feel the kick. So that's why I have the bass a bit higher, so I have room for the kick drum. So this kick drum is a bit subby of itself, but more is more. Bandwidth again around 10, and then let's boost the kick a bit. And then add some top end around, let's say a 5 kilohertz. Now, one important thing to note, I'm doing this soloed so I can like really demonstrate it. So what I'm looking for, normally I would do this in the mix. So let's just check it in the mix now. Even though it becomes a bit louder, hopefully you can feel that there's more energy if you listen to this on some good speakers or on some good headphones. The only thing I don't like about most kick drums is, let me solo it again, is around 200 or 100 hertz. There's some honkiness on most kick drums, which I'm not a big fan of. So that thing. And even when you remove that, because it's so close to the 60 hertz, it almost creates this illusion that the kick becomes deeper and more low-endy. Perhaps let's add a tiny bit of 2K. So when I turn this off, it's like thin and dark and honky. And sometimes what you can do is just add like a multiband compressor on this, just to keep the low end of the kick drum in check. So I have this around, let's say around 50 hertz and everything below that, and then just compress a tiny bit. Alright, so I have a couple of snares going to the snare bus, and most of the time I like to treat the snare bus by itself, or if I have an original track, then perhaps make that a bit brighter. But in this case, since I'm going for that heavy American stadium rock, heavily sampled drums, that's like the sound I'm going for, I think I'm just gonna do some processing on the snare bus. Now, one cool thing you could do again with the multiband compressor is even out the overall curve. And we're going to do the same thing perhaps on the shells. But the thing is, sometimes when you stack snare samples and stuff, the low mids, like around 200 hertz, can come in like a tiny bit honky. And instead of EQing, I like to do a multiband compressor. Sometimes I just prefer the sound of a multiband compressor, that it's compressing, instead of just EQ that's constantly there. And sometimes just experimenting. So just try whatever. So what I'll do is I'll bring this down, let's say between 70 and 300. And sometimes I also like to play with these to sort of shape the snare more than EQing. I know with EQing it's also shaping, but these are like these preset blocks. So that's the multiband compressor. Let's do some extra EQ moves. So now before we go to the shells bus, because the routing is pretty simple, kick goes to the kick and snare bus, snare goes to the snare bus, which then goes into the kick and snare bus, then toms, shells, and cymbals, and all of this goes into the drums group. But one thing I do a lot of the times, and when I tell this to people, sometimes they don't believe me, but sometimes I just route all of my toms into a toms bus and then just EQ on the toms bus, and that's it. So for an example, when we take a listen here, what I like to do is just scoop the mids on the toms, add some top end, tiny bit of low end, and then just filter off everything that's below, let's say a 90 hertz. Let's check it in the mix. So to emphasize these drums, I'm also using a snare room sample, which is going straight to the drums group. So when I later do compression on the shells bus, it doesn't get affected that much. So let's take a listen. Here, just cut a tiny bit of mids, and that's basically it. Like that room sample, even though I have room mics, it just adds some extra oomph to it. So let's go to the shells bus. So I have a multiband compressor on here, which was bypassed. Again, just to keep some overlapping things in check. It could be that the kick drum, maybe there's some extra processing here that it just nicely evens, compresses the perhaps extra low end a tiny bit, or some top end or in the higher frequencies. So I want to have some extra punch. So I'm gonna engage the or put in the vintage compressor, which I love, wonderful thing. Settings I always use 30 milliseconds attack. Let's say the release around 100 milliseconds, 4:1 ratio, and I think I'm going for max 3 to 4 decibels of gain reduction, just to get more of that compressed sound and a bit more punch on the drums. It just adds like a tiny bit of like that compressed sound, which I personally love. So let's listen to that in solo. Hopefully you can tell when I bypass the vintage compressor, it becomes a bit more weak. And if I engage it, like there's some more energy to it. I think I want to do some extra processing on the shells bus. Let's just engage the EQ M5, and just for fun, let's just turn some knobs. just to finalize a tiny bit, there's a tiny bit of mid-honk somewhere. And just to wrap things up, why not just add a compressor on all the drums, just to get some extra energy going? Now, just to experiment with this, why not just add like the black valve compressor in here? And let's like really almost destroy the drums and then just blend that in a bit. So let's see. So what we have here. So this is fully destroying the drums. We're having like 10 decibels of gain reduction. So that's completely destroying the drums. And even let's add some drive. So before and after. And now let's use the dry and wet knob to blend it in. And before I do that, pay attention to the snare, how much character of the snare is coming through thanks to this extreme compression. And the cymbals are pumping, so now let's use the blend knob. Can you tell how much more energy there's coming? So let's check it in the mix. So there you go. That sounds cool to me. Alright, so that's it for this video. Hopefully you learned something today. Hopefully there were some useful tips in this video for like mixing rock drums. If you have any questions about mixing rock drums, please let me know down in the comments. I'd be happy to help you guys out. So until then, see you next time. And thanks for watching. Cheers.